Hello and welcome to E333. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. This is another video in a series focusing on the fundamentals of Java. We're going to call this series Fundamentals Demo. And in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on how to set up a Java class with a main so that you can then use it to test functionality. And so the idea is that we want to sort of build a play space, if you would, that we can easily test concepts, code, syntax, etc. And so to begin with, what I'd like to do is I'd like to go ahead and create a new project, Java with Ant, Java application. And we're going to simply call this one Fundamentals Demo. And notice that I'm intentionally not putting a space between the two words, and I'm capitalizing both the F and the D. And then as far as the create main class, I'd like to do two things. First, I'd like to make EE333 the namespace, or rather the package. And then for the name of the main class, I'd like to call this Fundamentals Driver. And the term driver is not standard by any means, but it's a concept then that I'd like to carry forward so to show you that essentially we're creating a driver for driving other methods and for testing features. And so at this point, you can go ahead and hit finish. Just make sure to make a note of where you are saving this project to. And then once again, you should get the NetBeans template. You can go ahead and clean it up a little bit. I would encourage you to go ahead and practice adding the Java doc. We're not going to do that in this video. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on how to set up our main so that we can then utilize it for other testing. By the way, this video assumes that you have already completed your P1. We're actually going to borrow some of the code from your P1 driver to complete this one. So without further ado, then let's go ahead and take a look at the anatomy, if you would, of this .java file. So taking a look at the .java file, you should notice some things that look unusual and some things that look familiar. We'll focus on the familiar things first, and then we'll have plenty of time to look at the new things in a minute. To begin with, you'll see the public static void main. And this is your main entry point for the application. So main entry point of your application. And just like in a C application, you should only have one main entry point. You will, however, discover, though, that there are ways of getting around that. And also, in some cases, you may not even have a main. But once again, we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. The second thing that you should notice is the static keyword. And the static keyword is just simply a way of saying that this is shared between all instances. Well, we'll get to what an instance is in just a second. The key thing to note here is that it's shared, and it means that it's essentially accessible everywhere. And by everywhere, then it means referring to the public keyword. And so this means that it's accessible everywhere. And we're going to spend some time talking about the scope of a function, the scope of a field, and so on later in another video. But for right now, basically, what you want to know is the public static void main is your entry point into your Java application. Now, in a C application, you would have a argv and argc, where argc represents the count or the number of command line arguments, and argv would be an array of those arguments starting with 0 index, which would be the name of the executable itself, and then each subsequent argument after that. In Java, what you have is you have a single strings argument, or args, that represents a collection or array of strings. And one thing that you get from this is you get the buried in there as a field, the length of the strings array, or rather the length of the arguments array. And that gets around the necessity for the argc. So args.length is essentially your argc. So if you want to think of the args as being the argv from C, and then args.length being argc, or the number of strings or the number of arguments, then you can hopefully see some of the similarity back to the C applications that you have written in the past. Now, continuing on, we want to look once again back at the static main. And particularly, we want to talk real quick about the idea of this shared entry point. And what it means is that if you are going to call a function from a shared function, the function itself must also be shared, or you have to create an instance of the class. So what this leads us to is two ways to use our main. And I want to take the remainder of this video to show you the two different approaches. And so I'm going to create a couple of oddly named functions with the sole purpose of simply inserting a print statement to identify whether or not we have called them. And so to begin with, what I'd like to do is I'd like to have a public static, and I'm going to go ahead and make these first ones void, just because we don't necessarily have a particular purpose for them yet. We'll come back and work on this. But what I'd like to do now is I'd like to create a function that I refer to as a static demo. And a static demo simply means that it is a demo that can only be called from main directly or called elsewhere without the necessity of creating an instance. And I'm not really interested in having any sort of input argument, so I'm just going to leave those alone. And at this point, then inside, I'm simply going to say system.out.println, and I'm going to print out the word static demo. It's just, once again, a way for us to know that we have, in fact, called this function. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to create a second function, and I'm going to call it public void instance demo. And once again, it's going to have no input arguments, and it is just simply going to have a system.out.println in it. And once again, it simply has the name of the function, instance demo, in it. Now, neither of these have return values. We're not interested in that yet. We'll get there in just a second. But what I'd like to do now is I'd like to go into my main, and I want to attempt to call these two functions. And so to begin with, what I'm going to do is I'm just, much like what you would do in C, I'm just going to type in static demo. And this essentially makes a call to the static demo function. So it calls static demo function. Well, if we try the same thing now with the instance demo, and we're going to attempt, I'm going to go ahead and put the word here, attempt to call the instance demo. And you'll see that you get a warning, and actually an error rather, that says a non-static method instance demo cannot be referenced from a static context. And so what this is a way of saying is that you must have an instance of the fundamentals driver to be able to call this method. Well, in an earlier video, we talked about what is a class and what is an object. Well, a class you can sort of think of for right now as a cookie cutter or a template, if you would. And the object of a class is that cookie. And so you would use the class then to create a new instance of that fundamentals driver. And so to do so, or to do this, what we want to do now is we want to go ahead and create, I'm going to go ahead and do it right here. We want to go ahead and create an instance of this fundamentals driver. And I'm just going to call this one fundamentals instance. And to keep with the Java notation, I'm actually going to lowercase the variable name, the first letter of the variable name. And we want to specify the type of this variable. And we do that similar fashion to what we did in C. We want to preface the variable with the type. So in this case, it's going to be a fundamentals driver. And we're going to use a keyword that we have not used before, and that is going to be the new keyword. And we're going to set this fundamentals instance equal to a new fundamentals. And by the way, you can go ahead and use your control space bar here if you don't want to continue typing this out, but you can then create a new instance of this fundamentals driver. Now I'd like to do one other thing. I'd like us to temporarily get into the habit of prefixing everything with the package name. At this point then, what we do is we have created a new instance of our driver. So when main executes, it simply creates a new instance of this driver. And then at that point, then what we can do is we can say fundamentals instance dot instance demo. And this allows for us to call this non-static or instance version of our function. You can likewise prefix the package when you are declaring the type of the variable as well. That's a good habit to get into. Now, you might wonder, what's the advantage or disadvantage? Well, we'll have plenty of videos to be able to talk about this, but in the beginning, we want to remember that we are here to learn object-oriented design. And if you make everything a static function, that is not considered good object-oriented design practices. There are needs to have static methods, static functions, as well as static variables, but you don't want to overuse the static keywords. So I'm just simply going to make a little bit of a mention here that overuse of static variables, methods, functions, etc., is frowned upon in true OO design. Now, once again, we will find ourselves using it, and there are good reasons to do so. There's actually a couple of different patterns that we will take a look at in which we actually will use the static keyword. But once again, it's something that you want to use sparingly. So let's see how we go about doing this. So we're going to go ahead and build it. We're going to come out here to our command line. And I want to go ahead and CD over to this project now. This is going to be our fundamentals demo. I want to go into the build directory. And if I do type dir, I see my classes folder. And in there, I should see my EE333 folder. Now, I don't want to drill into my EE333 folder yet. Instead, what I want to do is I simply want to run the class file that I've just created using the Java runtime. And in this case, it's going to be Java EE333 for the package, and then the name of the class. And so if you don't remember, you can always look in the directory tree or in the project tree, or you can, of course, CD into the EE333 folder. But in this case, we should hopefully be able to remember that it is going to be fundamentals driver. All right, and you can see now that we are calling both our static demo and our instance demo, but we're doing it two different ways. The static demo is called directly from main. It's another shared method. And the instance demo requires us to create an object of type fundamentals driver. So it's an instance of this driver before we can actually run this method. Now, we've got a couple of other things that we want to do with respect to our main, but what we're going to do is we're going to leave this with one last method, and that is actually going to leverage our P1 driver. I said that I wanted to leverage some of the code that we had written earlier, particularly our get info. And so the idea here is, or getting our info rather, about the user. So the idea is that maybe you'd like to have an about in your executable, or maybe even a help. And so you've got a couple of different ways that you can do this. You could make this a instance method, but you ideally would want to be able to call the help or the about regardless of whether you have an instance of the driver created or not. So in this case, what we would like to do is we'd like to make one more static method or a shared method. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call it public static void, and I'm going to call it get info. And basically what it's going to do is it's simply going to print out the information that we have already collected about our user. And so in this case, our public static void get info will simply have the system.out.print lines from our earlier example. And then what you can do is you can simply call that particular method in our main. So in this case, get info. We'll go ahead and build it one last time, and then we'll run it. And you'll see that in addition to the static demo and the instance demo, we now have our system.out.print lines printing out the information about our user. So hopefully you found this video useful. In the next set of videos, we will take a look at how to actually leverage our input arguments from the command line. In other words, how can we leverage these args to be able to determine which method we would like to call. Once again, hopefully you found this video useful. As always, if you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to let me know, and thank you for watching.